If you're DC Comics and you want to destroy a character's legacy, you send in Tom King. He's the best man for the job. If you're Marvel Comics, you send in Jason Aaron to kill the character off, retcon everything special about the character out of existence, and then you get stuff like Punisher. We're on issue number 7 this week, and it feels almost like the coup de grace at this point. Jason Aaron has been dismantling Frank Castle for months now, and I feel like he's pretty much just done the job. We are led up into this. There's supposed to be a big fight between Punisher and Daredevil. Feels like they're leading up to a big crossover between Chip Zdarsky's Daredevil and this Punisher series, likely fighting Ares in the end. That's kind of what it feels like they're about to do. And I must say, talking about the confrontation between Punisher and Daredevil, there's not a whole lot to it. I think this comic book is like 35 pages in length, and we might get 5 or 6 pages of actual confrontation between Daredevil and Punisher. The rest of it are flashbacks of Frank Castle as a husband, as a father returning from the war. You can tell Jason Aaron does not like war, and I kind of respect that. I completely get that. War is not pretty, and the after effects of war are absolutely real. As somebody that spent 21 years in the United States Air Force, I am a retired master sergeant. I spent 1 year of my life in Afghanistan, and I have seen the fallout of people that are deployed, people that have been in war zones for years at a time, and it's absolutely real. But what Jason Aaron is really doing, he's taken the agency away from Frank Castle as the Punisher himself. You don't really see any Punisher in this comic book. You're just seeing all the events that kind of led up to him breaking. And apparently, if you read this comic book series, Frank Castle didn't become the Punisher because his wife and children were murdered on the streets, and he made a decision. He saw something, he said it was ghastly, and he decided that he was never going to allow that to happen to another family again. That is not what happened here. He was predestined to become the Punisher, the Hand of the Beast or something like that. He's the Slayer. He works for the Hand now. That's why we're getting this confrontation with Daredevil. I don't know. It doesn't feel good to me. I definitely want to hear from you guys. If you've been reading this Punisher series, and I thought it started out okay, but at this point, I'm very disillusioned with what Jason Aaron has been doing with Frank Castle. And that's what happens with Jason Aaron's work in Marvel Comics a lot of times. He started out with Thor. People like that run. By the end of it, he pretty much dismantled Thor. He got to work with Wolverine. He pretty much broke Wolverine. He worked with the X-Men. He pretty much broke the X-Men. He started out with the Avengers. Pretty fun comic book series for about the first 4 or 5 issues. Fell apart, and by the end, people were begging him not to be writing the Avengers anymore. And that's how I feel about Punisher at this point. As I said, when it opens up, there is this confrontation that was teased on the cover and in the last issue of Punisher that Daredevil and Frank Castle were finally going to have to duke it out. Apparently, Daredevil is aware that Frank Castle's wife has been resurrected of sorts by the Hand in order to get him to work with them and to lead their army. He's the general of all the ninjas now. That's why he's got the new logo. That's why he's got a sword. And Daredevil says, "Tell me that isn't your dead wife you keep locked up inside there." And he tells him to go home to Elektra. Obviously, they're newly married. And what exactly does Maria have to say about all this, Frank? Is she still even well enough to understand what's happening? He threatens to go and speak to her and tell her what's going on. And that leads to the confrontation that does happen after a hell of a lot of flashback scenes that are not too kind on the character of Frank Castle. And as I mentioned, take away all the agency of the character. We've seen this before. I think it was in Dark Reign where they resurrected Frank Castle's wife and kids. He set them on fire in there. That felt much more like the Frank Castle Punisher that we all know and love. But this is the story we get. And it turns out he is a terrible father. This is the monologue from Maria Castle, his wife. From a storytelling perspective, it does not make sense for her to narrate any of this because the Maria Castle that we know is dead. The one that we do have resurrected, we do see her, but she doesn't really have any of her memories left. So I guess he had to use this literary device, but in the context of the story, I don't think it makes sense. She talks about how she's working at the church, and the only job Frank could find was scrubbing gut traps in the meatpacking district, and he'd come home every night stinking of offal. I think he liked it that way because it kept me away from him. And then she says, "I realized I was always watching him out of the corner of my eye whenever he was around the children who were absolutely terrified of him. But in truth, he was even more afraid of them. After about a month, he started sleeping most nights in a tent out back." Just terrible stuff that makes no sense within the context of Frank Castle. This has never been presented about the character. Yes, he did go to Vietnam, and certainly he learned some skills that helped translate into becoming the Punisher, but it's the event of his wife and children dying, traumatizing him, making him a man of action to go out there and make sure it never happens again. It turns out He was a terrible father. He didn't really like his kids. They were absolutely terrified of him because he was so weird and apparently not really a loving father. Guess what? He wasn't a loving husband either. Maria says, I'd been dealing with pelvic pain since Frank Jr., and I ended up needing a hysterectomy. I had to be in the hospital for a few days while Frank watched the kids. That is absolutely terrible. If your wife has a hysterectomy and has to be held up in the hospital for days at a time, you go and you be with your wife. That's what a good husband does. That's what Frank Castle would have done if he had a choice about it. But in this story, because it's Jason Aaron, who apparently either hates Frank Castle, the character, or was given the code red from CB Cebulski, that's not what's going on here. He's a terrible husband. He left his wife at the hospital after she had a hysterectomy. That is a major change to his wife's life, and he apparently didn't even care. Not to mention the fact that when he finally goes to church and confesses his sins to the priest, he actually gets his wife fired, and they're no longer allowed to go to that church anymore. Because apparently he's been a serial killer since he's 8 years old now, if you didn't know that, if you haven't been reading this. Absolutely despicable stuff on the part of Jason Aaron and Marvel Comics, in my opinion, but is unfortunately par for the course in what Jason Aaron does with characters in Marvel Comics. He takes them, he recontextualizes their past, he retcons them completely, and then he changes wholly who the character are moving forward. Hopefully, everyone ignores everything in this comic book, because this is just the tip of the iceberg of the changes that he has made, the way that he has portrayed Frank Castle as a serial killer who didn't love his wife, didn't love his kids, was dangerous from day one, and was never pushed to the breaking point when they were murdered. He was actually groomed by the hand since he was like 5 years old. When we finally do get back to the confrontation, Daredevil says, listen, you are under the control of the beast himself. You're essentially possessed at this point. I had this happen to me, and Doctor Strange actually taught me a spell, if it should ever happen again, to essentially exorcise myself. So he brings out his cross. He decides he's going to do an exorcism on Frank Castle after they fight a little bit here and there. As I mentioned, the confrontation, which is the selling point of the comic book based on the cover and the cliffhanger from the last issue, is very brief. He starts to do the exorcism, and things do not go well for him. In fact, he realizes he's not possessed at all. Mary, Mother of God, I am not a puppet. I am not a lost soul in need of salvation. I am what I have always been. I am the Punisher. Daredevil says, you're right, Frank. It's not the beast I should be worried about. It's you. And then he says, her? He looks down and realizes he's flying. So now Frank Castle, one of the interesting things about the character is that he has no powers. He's never had powers. He certainly has never flown in the existence of the character, but he's not possessed. It's clearly defined right here by Jason Aaron. He's not possessed by the beast, but all of a sudden he has the power of flight and is flying through the air with Daredevil. Who asked for this? Why do Marvel Comics continuously let Jason Aaron come onto these runs with major characters and just destroy the foundation of who they are? He's no longer just an ordinary man put in a terrible situation who decided to be a man of action and goes too far, in my opinion. I don't think murdering's a good thing. I think Batman has the right idea if you want to be a vessel of justice in a corrupt world. But he's no longer an ordinary man. He can actually fly now. He was no longer a loving father, a loving husband. He was a serial killer from the day he was born, and he treated all of them like crap. Although there are a couple of moments where he does protect his kids in this comic book. But the recontextualization of Frank Castle, the Punisher, in this comic book is just horrifying. I don't understand how CB Cebulski, Tom Brevoort, and the Brain Trust at Marvel Comics can continue justifying putting Jason Aaron on major characters. He's just a hatchet man at this point. And as far as I'm concerned, they're accomplices at a minimum. They're likely the reason that all this is happening. We know Marvel Comics does not like the Punisher logo because it's associated with bad groups like the military and police. They wanted to get the Punisher logo ruined, so now it's on Ares. They've got a new Punisher logo now that he's with the hand, and now he can fly. It's like, what is going on here? Of course, these aren't the first changes that Jason Aaron has made to the character. He had already destroyed his origin. I've talked about it here and there, or at least alluded to it in this video already. If you don't know the full details, and if you haven't actually seen how Jason Aaron destroyed the origin of Frank Castle Punisher, you need to see this video. I made this directly for you. This is a fantastic breakdown of everything Jason Aaron did wrong with the origin of Punisher. If you don't see it here, there's also a link in the video description.